The last time Tate Connors drew his Colt .45, he buried 3 men in the same grave and swore on his dying father's Bible he'd never kill again. 15 years of silence had settled over the former gunslinger like dust on an abandoned homestead. His calloused hands, once steady as winter stone around a trigger, now gentled horses and mended fences on the outskirts of Redemption Creek. The townspeople whispered his name with equal measures of respect and wariness, the man who'd cleaned out the Blackwater gang single-handed, then hung up his guns to become the quietest rancher in 3 counties. But on that scorching August morning, when Livia Whitmore appeared at his gate, her widow's black dress torn and her emerald eyes blazing with desperate fury, Tate knew his decade and a half of peace was about to shatter like glass under a hammer. "Mr. Connors." Her voice carried the refined edges of Eastern education, but desperation had roughened it to gravel. "I need you to teach me to kill." Tate's weathered hands stilled on the gate latch. Behind her, dust devils danced across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance, a red-tailed hawk screamed its hunting cry. The woman before him trembled, not with fear, but with barely contained rage that seemed to radiate from her small frame like heat from a forge. "Ma'am, I think you've got the wrong. My husband spoke of you." She stepped closer, and he caught the scent of lavender water mixed with trail dust and something else, the metallic tang of dried blood on her torn sleeve. "Benjamin said you were the fastest gun in the territory before you retired." The name Benjamin Whitmore struck him like a physical blow. Tate remembered the young doctor who'd patched him up after that final gunfight, the man who'd listened without judgment as Tate confessed his sins and his vow to never draw again. Ben had married his Eastern bride the following spring, and Tate had watched from afar as they built their practice in town, bringing new life into the world instead of ending it. "Ben's dead." The words fell from her lips like stones into still water that Tate's throat constricted. "When? 3 days ago." Her voice cracked, but she lifted her chin higher. "Along with 7 other good people. The Cairo Pierce gang rode into town looking for you, Mr. Connors. When they couldn't find you, they decided to make do with whoever they could get their hands on." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Tate felt something cold and familiar unfurling in his chest, the old hunger for vengeance that he'd spent 15 years trying to bury. "I ain't that man anymore," he said finally, but the words tasted like ash. Livia Whitmore laughed, and it was the most bitter sound he'd ever heard. "Then who is?" "The sheriff's dead too, along with his deputy. The town council wants to hire mercenaries, but we can't afford them. And Cairo Pierce." She paused, and her small hands clenched into fists. "He told everyone in Redemption Creek that he'd be back in a week to finish what he started, unless someone could outdraw him at high noon." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small derringer, its pearl handle gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "I may be just a woman, and I may be just a doctor's widow, but I won't let that monster destroy what's left of our town. If you won't face him, then I will." Tate stared at the tiny weapon in her hands. She held it wrong, thumb too high, grip too loose. Against a man like Cairo Pierce, she'd be dead before she cleared leather. "You ever fire that thing before?" "Once. At my wedding." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Benjamin insisted I learn. Said a frontier wife needed to know how to protect herself. I hit the barn door from 10 feet away. Cairo Pierce ain't a barn door." "No." Her eyes met his, and he saw something in their depths that made his breath catch. Not just rage, but a terrible, beautiful determination. "He's the man who put 6 bullets in my husband while Ben tried to tend a wounded child. He's the man who laughed while Mrs. Henderson begged for her son's life. He's the man who told me." Her voice faltered for just a moment. "Who told me he'd save me for last because he'd heard Eastern women were sweeter." The familiar weight seemed to settle around Tate's hips where his gun belt used to rest. He could almost feel the smooth walnut grip of his Colt, could almost hear the whisper of steel on leather that had once been as natural as breathing. "Teaching you to shoot and teaching you to kill ain't the same thing," he said carefully. "Then, teach me both." Behind her, a dust cloud was rising on the horizon, riders approaching fast. Tate's hand moved instinctively to his empty holster, and he cursed under his breath. His guns lay wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his cedar chest, silent as the dead men who'd forced him to put them there. Livia followed his gaze and went pale. How many? Tate squinted against the glare. 3 horses, maybe 4. Too far to make out faces, but something about the way they rode, loose and arrogant, like they owned every inch of ground their horses' hooves touched, made his jaw clench. Get inside, he told her. Mr. Connors, now. But even as she hurried toward his modest farmhouse, her black skirts rustling against the dry grass, Tate knew it was too late for hiding. The riders had seen them, and their course was shifting straight toward the ranch with the inevitability of a summer storm that he followed her inside, his boots heavy on the worn wooden floors. The house was sparse, a man's dwelling, built for function, rather than comfort. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel bare except for a single daguerreotype of his parents. No woman's touch softened the hard edges. No flowers graced the rough-hewn table. This was the home of a man who'd chosen solitude over society, silence over the thunder of gunfire. Livia stood in the center of his main room, her presence like a flame in the shadows. Despite the dust and desperation that clung to her, she carried herself with an innate grace that spoke of drawing rooms and tea services, of a world far removed from the harsh realities of frontier justice. You have children back east? Tate asked, moving to the window to watch the approaching riders. No. The single word carried a weight of old grief. Benjamin and I, we tried. The Lord saw fit to bless us in other ways. Through the glass, he could make out the riders more clearly now. For men, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. They rode like they'd been traveling hard, and there was something in their casual cruelty toward their mounts that made Tate's teeth grind together. A man who'd abuse a horse wouldn't hesitate to hurt a woman. Mrs. Whitmore, he said without turning from the window. That Derringer of yours, is it loaded? Yes. 2 shots. Yes. Against 4 men, that ain't much comfort. She moved to stand beside him at the window, and he caught that scent again, lavender and trail dust, and something indefinably feminine that made his pulse quicken despite the danger. Then perhaps you should reconsider your retirement, Mr. Connors. The riders were close enough now that he could see their faces. Rough men, unshaven and hard-eyed, with the look of those who'd lived too long on the wrong side of the law. The one in the lead sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to having others step aside when he approached. Memphis Kerrigan, one of Cairo's lieutenants, if memory served. You know them? Livia's voice was steady, but he could see her knuckles had gone white where she gripped the windowsill. I know their type. Tate stepped away from the window and walked to an old oak chest that sat against the far wall. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the heavy lid, and the smell of cedar and gun oil rose to meet him. Beneath layers of carefully folded cloth lay his past, twin Colt .45s in worn leather holsters, their surfaces blackened with age and use that he'd cleaned them every month for 15 years, a ritual he couldn't explain even to himself. Perhaps some part of him had always known this day would come. Mr. Connors? Livia's voice seemed to come from very far away. The guns felt strange in his hands, heavier than he remembered, yet somehow familiar as his own heartbeat. The worn grips settled into his palms like old friends, and muscle memory made his fingers check the cylinders automatically. Loaded. He'd kept them loaded all these years, telling himself it was simple prudence while knowing it for the lie it was. 15 years, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Benjamin used to say that some things are too important to stay buried forever. Livia had moved closer, and when he looked up, her green eyes were fixed on his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. He said you were the kind of man who'd die before he'd let innocent people suffer. Your husband was a good man, too good for the likes of me. And yet here you are, reaching for your guns. Outside, the riders had reached his gate. Memphis Kerrigan called out in a voice that carried easily across the yard. Tate Connors. We know you're in there, old man. Come on out, and we'll make this quick. Tate buckled the gun belt around his waist, and the weight of it settled against his hips like a benediction. Or a curse. The distinction had never been entirely clear. Stay behind me, he told Livia, and whatever happens, don't try to be a hero. That little pop gun of yours won't stop a determined man, and I'd rather not have to worry about keeping you alive while I'm trying to stay that way myself. She nodded, but there was something in her expression that suggested she had no intention of cowering in corners while others fought her battles. It was the same look he'd seen in her eyes when she'd asked him to teach her to kill. The look of a woman who'd already decided she had nothing left to lose. Tate opened the door and stepped onto his porch, his hands hanging loose at his sides. The afternoon sun slanted across the yard, throwing long shadows that seemed to reach toward him like grasping fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, sweet and mournful as a funeral hymn that I in the distance. Memphis. Kerrigan's familiar laugh carried on the wind, cruel and mocking, like the sound a coyote might make if it could speak. Memphis Kerrigan sat his horse like a king surveying conquered territory, his weather-beaten face split by a grin that held no warmth. The three men flanking him shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons with the nervous energy of wolves scenting blood. "Well, I'll be damned," Memphis drawled, his voice carrying the lazy menace of a rattlesnake's. Warning. The great Tate Connors, wearing iron again after all these years. Cairo's gonna be mighty pleased to hear about this. Tate stepped to the edge of his porch, his boots echoing hollow on the weathered boards. The familiar weight of his guns felt both foreign and natural, like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit, but still remembered the shape of his body. Memphis. He kept his voice level, conversational. Still riding with that murdering snake. I see. Now, that ain't very neighborly. Memphis's grin widened, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. Especially considering we came all this way just to deliver a message. Behind him, Tate heard the soft whisper of fabric as Livia moved closer to the door. He could feel her presence like heat against his back, could almost hear her heart hammering against her ribs. The woman had courage. He'd give her that. Most folks would have been halfway to the root cellar by now. I'm listening, Tate said. Memphis leaned forward in his saddle, leather creaking. Cairo knows you've been playing farmer out here, living all quiet and peaceful like. But see, that don't sit right with him. A man makes a reputation like yours. He don't get to just walk away from it. I walked away 15 years ago. Did you, though? One of the other riders spoke up, a lean, dark-haired man with dead eyes that Tate recognized as Enzo Wyatt, Cairo's enforcer. Because word is, you might be getting back in the game. Heard tell a certain widow woman came calling today, asking for lessons. Tate's hand drifted closer to his right-hand Colt. Not enough to be threatening, just enough to be ready. News. Travels fast. Fast enough. Memphis spat into the dust beside his horse. See, Cairo's got himself a proposition for you, old man. High noon, 6 days from now, right in the middle of Redemption Creek's main street. You show up, you draw against him fair and square, and win or lose. He rides out afterward and leaves your little town alone. And if I don't show? Memphis's eyes glittered with cruel anticipation. Well, then he burns Redemption Creek to the ground, starting with the church and working his way through every house that's got women and children in it. Real slow-like. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the restless stamping of horses. Tate felt something cold and deadly unfurling in his chest, the old darkness he'd spent 15 years trying to tame. It whispered to him in a voice like gunpowder and grave dirt, reminding him how good it had felt to be the fastest gun in 3 territories, how simple life became when problems could be solved with 6 inches of steel and a steady hand. 6 days, he said finally. 6 days. Memphis touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. Don't disappoint us, Connors. Cairo's been looking forward to this dance for a long time. They wheeled their horses around and rode off in a cloud of dust and laughter, their voices carrying back across the prairie like the howls of coyotes. Tate stood on his porch until they disappeared into the heat shimmer, then turned to find Livia watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're going to do it, she said. Not a question. Seems I don't have much choice. She stepped onto the porch beside him, her green eyes fixed on the distant dust cloud. You could run. Take a horse and ride north, or south, or anywhere but here. No one would blame you. You would. Yes. The admission came without hesitation. I would. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the afternoon heat pressing down on them like a physical weight. A red-winged blackbird perched on the gate post, its scarlet shoulder patches bright as blood against its dark feathers. Tell me about him, Tate said. Your husband. Livia's face softened, and for a moment she looked younger, almost girlish. Benjamin was gentle, too gentle for this country, perhaps, but he couldn't bear to see suffering without trying to help. When the cholera came through 2 summers ago, he worked for 3 days straight without sleep, tending to anyone who needed him. Didn't matter if they could pay or not. Sounds like a good man. The best. Her voice caught slightly. He used to read to me in the evenings. Poetry mostly. Keats and Shelley, and sometimes Shakespeare. He said civilization was just another word for beauty, and beauty was the only thing worth fighting for. Tate thought about the books gathering. Dust on his shelf inside. Practical volumes on animal husbandry and crop rotation, nothing that would have impressed a cultured Eastern woman. Must have been quite a change, coming out here. I thought I was prepared. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'd read about the frontier in Harper's Weekly, seen the illustrations of noble pioneers taming the wilderness. I imagined myself as some sort of frontier Madonna, bringing grace and learning to the savage West. And instead I learned that grace is a luxury you can't afford when there's a dust storm coming. And that learning doesn't mean much when you're trying to birth a breached calf at 3 in the morning. She touched the torn sleeve of her dress absently. But I also learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. And that sometimes strength means picking up a gun when everything else has failed. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. In the distance, Tate could see his small herd of cattle moving toward the water trough, their hooves raising small puffs of dust with each step. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully. Livia, what happened in town? What Cairo did to your husband? And the others, that's on him, not on you. You don't need to carry that weight. She turned to face him fully, and he was struck again by the intensity in her green eyes. Don't I? I'm the one who insisted Benjamin stay in town instead of moving to Denver like he wanted. I'm the one who said Redemption Creek needed us, that we had an obligation to the people there. You couldn't have known, couldn't I? Her voice rose slightly, then caught. Cairo Pierce has been terrorizing this territory for 2 years. Everyone knew he was dangerous. But I thought our mission was more important than our safety. I thought God would protect us because we were doing his work. Tate reached out without thinking and touched her hand. Her skin was soft, but marked with small calluses, the hands of a woman who'd learned to work for her survival. God doesn't stop bullets, ma'am. That's what Colts are for. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. Is that what you're going to teach me? To trust in steel instead of salvation. I'm going to teach you to survive. But as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, neither of them could shake the feeling that survival might require more. Then either of them was prepared to sacrifice. Dawn came like a gunshot, sudden and violent, splitting the darkness with shafts of copper light that turned the prairie grass into waves of molten gold. Tate had been awake for hours, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the horizon for riders that hadn't come. Yet, behind him, the house was silent except for the soft breathing of the woman who'd spent the night in his spare room. He'd offered to ride her back to town, but she'd refused with that stubborn tilt of her chin that was becoming familiar. If you're going to teach me to shoot, she'd said, we'd best get started. The screen door creaked, and Livia emerged wrapped in one of his old shirts over her torn dress. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and in the morning light, she looked younger, more vulnerable than the fierce woman who'd demanded. He'd teach her to kill. Couldn't sleep either, she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Don't sleep much these days. He handed her his untouched coffee, and she accepted it gratefully. Bad dreams have a way of finding you when you close your eyes. What do you dream about? The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Tate watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, its wings catching the early light. Faces mostly. Men I killed. They don't look angry in the dreams. That's the strange part. They just look disappointed. Livia sipped the coffee, made a face at its bitter strength, but kept drinking. Benjamin used to say that conscience was God's way of keeping us human. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man. Wise enough to know I'd need more than prayers to survive out here. She set down the cup and looked at him directly. When do we start? Tate stood and walked to the edge of the porch, his boots echoing on the worn boards. The morning air carried the scent of sage and distant rain, a storm building somewhere beyond the mountains. First thing you need to understand is that learning to shoot and learning to kill are two different lessons entirely. Then, teach me both. Killing a man changes you, Livia. Changes you in ways you can't undo, no matter how many prayers you say or how many good deeds you do afterward. You sure you're ready for that? She joined him at the porch rail, and he could smell the lavender water she'd used to wash her face. Despite everything, the danger, the grief, the violence hanging over them like a storm cloud, she still maintained those small rituals of civilization. 3 nights ago, I held my husband while he bled to death in our parlor, she said quietly. Cairo Pierce stood in our doorway and laughed while Benjamin tried to tell me he loved me through a mouthful of blood. So yes, Mr. Connors, I'm ready. Something in her voice made him look at her more closely. There was steel there, but also something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle with unease. All right then. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn. Lesson 1. Never draw a gun unless you're prepared to use it. Behind the barn, he'd set up a makeshift shooting range years ago. Tin cans balanced on fence posts, targets carved into the side of an old oak tree. The morning light slanted across the open space, creating sharp lines of shadow and brightness. Tate drew his right-hand Colt in one smooth motion, the movement as natural as breathing despite 15 years of disuse. The gun cleared Leatherwith. A whisper of steel, and before Livia could blink, 3 tin cans exploded in rapid succession. The sound of the shots rolled across the prairie like thunder, and she flinched despite herself. My God, she breathed. You're fast. Used to be faster. He reloaded methodically, his fingers working without conscious thought. But speed ain't everything. Accuracy matters more, and accuracy comes from practice. He handed her his left hand gun, watching as she took it with both hands. The Colt looked enormous in her small grip, and he could see her struggling with its weight. It's heavier than I expected. Good guns always are. He moved behind her, his hands covering hers to adjust her grip. Keep your trigger finger straight until you're ready to shoot. And don't close your eyes when you pull the trigger. I've seen grown men do that. For the next hour, he walked her through the basics. Stance, grip, sight alignment, breathing. She was a quick learner. He had to give her that. But there was something in the way she handled the weapon that bothered him. Too eager, too hungry. Like she was imagining Cairo Pierce's face on every target. That's enough for now, he said when she'd managed to hit the broad side of the barn twice out of 6 shots. I'm just getting started. And that's the problem. He took the gun from her hands, noting the way her fingers lingered on the grip. You're thinking about it too much. When the time comes, you won't have time to think. They walked back toward the house, the morning heat already beginning to build. Tate was about to suggest they take a break when he noticed something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Fresh hoof prints in the dust near his gate. Not from Memphis Kerrigan's horses. These were different. Smaller, more delicate. A woman's horse. We had a visitor last night, he said, his hand moving instinctively. To his gun, Livia followed his gaze to the tracks. Who would ride out here in the dark? Before he could answer, a voice called out from behind the house. Hello, the ranch. Tate spun, his Colt clearing leather before he'd consciously decided to draw. A woman emerged from the shadow of his route. Seller, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. She was young, maybe 25, with corn silk hair and blue eyes that held secrets. Easy, Tate, she said, and her voice carried a slight accent he couldn't place. It's just me. And who might me be? But even as he asked, something about her seemed familiar. The shape of her face, the way she carried herself. My name is Sky Davison. She lowered her hands slowly. Though I used to go by Sky Pierce. Before I had sense enough to change it. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Tate kept his gun trained on her, but his mind was reeling. Cairo's daughter. Sister actually. Half-sister, to be precise. Her smile was bitter as winter wind. And before you ask, no, he doesn't know I'm here. If he did, I'd be dead already. Livia stepped closer to Tate, her hand finding his arm. What do you want? Sky's eyes shifted between them, calculating. I want to help you kill my brother. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm. Tate felt something cold settle in his stomach, the feeling that the game had just changed in ways he didn't understand. Why? He asked finally. Sky's carefully composed expression cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Because 15 years ago, Cairo murdered our father to take control of the gang. And I've been waiting 15 years for someone good enough to make him pay. She reached slowly into her coat and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was Paz. It has names, dates, places, everything you'd need to know about Cairo's operation, including where he's hiding the gold from the cattleman's bank robbery. Tate's breath caught. The cattleman's bank job had been legendary. 20,000 in gold coins, vanished without a trace along with the gang that had taken it. There's more, Sky continued. Cairo's planning something big for after he kills you, Tate. Something that'll make the Redemption Creek massacre look like a church social. He's got 50 men camped in Devil's Canyon, and they're not planning to just rob banks. But as she held out the journal, her sleeve fell back to reveal a brand burned into her wrist, the twisted snake that marked Cairo Pierce's property. And Tate realized that everything he thought he knew about the next 6 days had just become a lie. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under a sky the color of polished steel. Tate stood in his doorway, watching dust clouds rise on the horizon as Cairo's men rode toward Redemption Creek to collect their human insurance. Everything now depended on timing, trust, and the kind of desperate courage that made legends out of ordinary people. You sure about this? He asked Livia for the 10th time. She checked the small knife hidden in her boot, then the two-shot derringer tucked into her corset. Her widow's dress had been artfully torn in new places to make her look more helpless, but her green eyes blazed with deadly purpose. I've been sure since the moment they killed Benjamin. She touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the lines that 15 years of guilt had carved there. The question is, are you ready to trust me? With my life, he said, and meant it. Sky emerged from the barn leading 3 horses, her father's journal tucked safely in her saddlebags along with enough dynamite to bring down half of Devil's Canyon. She'd changed into men's clothes, worn denim and a faded shirt that made her look like any other ranch hand. They'll be back with the hostages by noon, she said. That gives us maybe 2 hours to get into position. The ride to Devil's Canyon passed in tense silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The plan was simple in concept, but hellish. In execution, Livia would allow herself to be captured along with the other hostages, then signal when Cairo's men were distracted. Sky would use the mining tunnel to plant charges that would collapse the canyon entrance, trapping the gang inside. And Tate would walk into the deadliest crossfire of his life and pray that 15 years of living peaceful hadn't slowed his draw. They separated at the canyon mouth, Livia riding toward the trail where she'd intercept the hostage party, Sky disappearing into the maze of rock formations with her explosive cargo, and Tate finding a position where he could watch the canyon floor through his father's old spyglass, BY 1130. The hostages had arrived. Tate counted 12 civilians, mostly women and children, just as Sky had predicted. Mrs. Henderson clutched her young son to her chest, while little Mary Townsend wept silently beside her mother. And there, looking perfectly terrified despite the steel in her spine, was Livia. Cairo Pierce himself rode at the head of the column, and seeing him again after 15 years hit Tate like a physical blow. The man had aged badly. His face was a map of cruelty and violence, marked by scars and the kind of deep lines that came from a lifetime of evil choices. But his hands were still steady on his reins, and the twin colts at his hips gleamed with careful maintenance. Time to dance, old friend, Tate murmured, and began his descent toward the canyon floor. The makeshift arena was a natural amphitheater of red rock, with the hostages corralled on one side and Cairo's men positioned exactly where Sky had said they'd be. Memphis Kerrigan crouched behind a boulder with a rifle, while 2 others had found cover among the scattered rocks. The trap was set perfectly, except now Tate knew where all the pieces were. Tate Connors. Cairo's voice echoed off the canyon. Walls, you actually came. I was starting to think you'd lost your spine along with your reputation. Tate walked into the center of the arena, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The sun was directly overhead now, creating harsh shadows and blinding patches of reflected light. High noon, just like in the old stories. I'm here, Cairo. Let the civilians go. Oh, they'll go free, all right. Soon as you're dead. Cairo dismounted and walked forward, his hands hanging loose at his sides. You know, I always wondered what it would feel like to outdraw the great Tate Connors. Guess we're about to find out. In the crowd of hostages, Tate saw Olivia catch his eye for just a moment. Her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her hidden derringer, and he knew she was ready. Last chance, Cairo. Walk away. And miss this? I don't think so. Cairo's grin was all teeth and malice. Memphis. Enzo. Soon as I draw, you boys light him up. But as Cairo's hand flashed toward his gun, several things happened at once. Livia's derringer barked twice, dropping the guards closest to the hostages. Little Mary Townsend screamed, but it was a signal, not terror, and suddenly every helpless woman in the group was moving, producing hidden knives and rocks and fighting back against their captors. The canyon wall exploded in a shower of rock and dust as Sky's charges detonated, sealing the entrance and trapping Cairo's army inside their own fortress. And Tate drew point 15 years fell away like autumn leaves as his Colt cleared leather with the speed that had made him legend. Cairo was fast, faster than Tate remembered, but not fast enough. The two shots came so close together they sounded like one, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Cairo's bullet whined past Tate's ear, chipping rock behind him. Tate's found its mark dead center, dropping the outlaw leader in a sprawl of dust and blood. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of falling rocks and the distant cries of confusion from Cairo's trapped men. Tate stood over his fallen enemy, smoke still curling from his gun barrel, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years: peace. It's over, he said, and holstered his weapon. Livia ran to him across the dusty arena, her torn skirts flying, and he caught her in his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Which, he realized with sudden clarity, she was. Did I do well? She asked against his chest. You did perfect. He kissed the top of her head, tasting dust and gunpowder and something infinitely sweeter. Though I'm thinking your late husband wouldn't approve of all that shooting. Benjamin always said a woman should know how to protect what she loves. She looked up at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams. And I do love you, Tate Connors. God help me, but I do. Behind them, Sky was helping to free the remaining hostages while keeping watch on the trapped gang members. The surviving outlaws would face territorial justice, but their reign of terror was over. A month later, Tate stood in the same spot, where he'd faced Cairo Pierce, but this time he wore a borrowed suit instead of gun leather. The canyon had been cleared and cleaned, and now it echoed with very different sounds: the laughter of children, the murmur of wedding guests, and the gentle voice of the new preacher reading from Corinthians. Livia stood beside him in a dress of cream silk that caught the afternoon light like captured sunshine. In her hands, she held a bouquet of wild roses, the first flowers to bloom in Devil's Canyon since the spring rains had come. Do you, Tate, take Livia to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. When they kissed, the canyon walls rang with applause and cheers. Somewhere in the crowd, Sky Davison, now the new sheriff of Redemption Creek, wiped away a tear and checked the time on her father's old pocket watch. As the sun set over the transformed canyon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and rose, Tate realized that some things were indeed worth fighting for. Beauty, love, the chance to turn a place of death into a garden of new beginnings. The last gunfighter had hung up his weapons for good, but the man who'd taken his place was ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. Well, now that there was quite a tale, wasn't it? If you enjoyed watching Tate and Livia find love among the Gunsmoke and Roses, don't forget to give this story a like and subscribe for more Wild West adventures. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from folks all across this great frontier we call home.